There is a map on the wall of the Ordnance Survey headquarters in Southampton that has never been shown to the public. Not because it is classified in the conventional sense, not because it contains the kind of military secrets that people usually associate with government restriction and official silence, but because what is drawn on it would force a complete and uncomfortable reconsideration of what Britain actually is beneath the surface of the land that millions of people cross every day on their morning commute, on weekend rambles through the countryside, on school trips to heritage sites, and on family holidays to places that every guidebook treats as simple and well understood and thoroughly documented. What is drawn on that map, if such a map exists as the weight of evidence suggests it does, represents something that the British government decided in the middle of the 20th century that ordinary people simply did not need to know about. What began as a wartime emergency measure, defensible in the context of its time, quietly became, over the course of the following decades, a systematic, deliberate, and extraordinarily thorough program of erasure. Ancient sites vanished from public maps. Earthworks were relabeled or removed entirely from official cartographic records. Underground structures were reclassified as non-existent or simply omitted from the official account. Whole categories of archaeology were buried under layers of bureaucratic silence, so thick and so consistently maintained that most people living in Britain today have no idea that the landscape they inhabit is significantly more complex, significantly older, and significantly more remarkable than the version of it they have been allowed to see. This is not a conspiracy theory in the loose and dismissive sense that phrase usually implies. This is documented history. The mechanism by which it happened is not secret. The laws that enabled it are matters of public record, available to anyone willing to spend an afternoon in a library or navigating the archives of parliamentary committees and legal proceedings. The testimony of people who worked inside the system, who walked those ancient fields and saw what was there and were then told in clear and unambiguous terms to pretend it was not, is available to anyone who knows where to look and has the patience to piece it together from the fragments that have survived the decades of careful management. What is not available, what has never been made available despite decades of freedom of information, requests, legal challenges, parliamentary questions, and the determined efforts of researchers working inside and outside the academic mainstream, is the full picture, the complete accounting. The honest answer to a question that grows more pressing with every year that passes and every new discovery that LiDAR scanning and ground-penetrating radar and independent field research drags back into the light. The question is this: what exactly did the British government find under its own soil in the decades following the Second World War? And why did it decide that finding was too important, or too strange, or too challenging to the story it wanted to tell about the past, to share with the people who live above it? To understand what happened after 1950, you need to understand what Britain actually is in geological and archaeological terms, understood not as a set of famous monuments, but as a complete landscape with a density of ancient human activity that has never been fully reckoned with. The island that sits at the northwestern edge of the European continent is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most densely archaeologically significant landmasses on the planet relative to its size. That is not an exaggeration, not a piece of national mythology, but a straightforward statement about the concentration of prehistoric human construction that survives above and below its surface. The number of known prehistoric monuments per square kilometre in Britain exceeds that of virtually any comparable territory on Earth. There are more standing stone circles in England, Scotland, and Wales than there are in the rest of Northern Europe combined. The number of identified hill forts, those elevated enclosures ringed by earthen banks and ditches that follow the ridgelines of Britain with a regularity that seems almost impossibly comprehensive when you see them on a map, runs into the thousands. The number of Neolithic long barrows, Bronze Age round barrows, Iron Age settlements, Romano-British farmsteads, and ancient trackways that have been formally identified and catalogued, reaches into the hundreds of thousands. And all of that, every last recorded site, represents only what survives above ground, only what has been found so far, only what has been allowed to be found and recorded and shared. The underground dimension of this archaeological landscape is a different matter entirely, and it is the underground dimension that sits at the heart of this investigation. The Ordnance Survey, the agency responsible for producing the official maps of Great Britain, was founded in 1791. Its name tells you something important and often overlooked about its origins and its fundamental institutional character. It was not founded to help farmers navigate between their fields, not founded to assist travellers planning routes between market towns, and not founded as a scholarly exercise in geographic knowledge for its own sake. It was founded for military purposes, born directly from the threat of French invasion during the Revolutionary Wars, because the British Army needed accurate maps of its own territory in order to move troops effectively, position artillery, and plan defensive operations in the event that the enemy crossed the Channel. The word ordnance in the agency's name refers to artillery and military equipment in the broadest sense, an etymology that reveals the surveying agency's true parentage. From its very first survey, conducted on the south coast of England, precisely because that coast faced France across the narrow waters of the English Channel, the Ordnance Survey existed at the intersection of mapping and military security. What went on maps and what was left off maps was always, at some fundamental level, a decision made with national security in mind. That heritage is the context within which the post- and 1950 removals took place. It was not a betrayal of the agency's founding purpose. In a way that should give us pause, it was a fulfillment of it. The Ordnance Survey produced its first large-scale maps of Britain in the early 19th century, and those early maps are extraordinary documents to spend time with. They are filled with detail that would later, in the second half of the 20th century, disappear from the official cartographic record. Earthworks and mounds and enclosures and ancient trackways that were clearly visible to the surveyors walking those fields in the 1800s were recorded faithfully and in considerable detail, marked with notations that reflected both their physical reality and the local knowledge about what they were and what they were called. The labourers and farmers and shepherds who had lived near these structures for generations knew their names, knew the stories associated with them, knew which ones produced strange acoustic effects in certain weather conditions, and knew which ones, when someone dug into them out of curiosity or necessity, seemed to go down much further than they had any reason to go. That local knowledge was recorded by the early OS surveyors because their job, as they understood it, was to record everything that was there. And then, over time, that job changed. The first systematic alterations to what appeared on British maps came during the First World War. The logic was straightforward and largely defensible in the context of 1914. If Britain were to be invaded or subjected to sustained aerial bombardment, accurate maps showing roads, rail lines, industrial facilities, reservoirs, and military installations would be a significant and potentially catastrophic gift to the enemy. Maps were accordingly modified. Certain details were omitted or falsified. When the war ended, most of those alterations were reversed and the maps returned to something close to their pre-war state. But something had been established during those war years that would prove far more significant than anyone in 1918 recognized. The government had demonstrated, and the courts had confirmed, that the content of official maps was a matter of national security, subject to official control, and that the right of the public to accurate cartographic information about their own country was explicitly and legally subordinate to the right of the state to withhold information it deemed sensitive. That precedent, once established in law and in institutional practice, does not disappear when the immediate threat that produced it is removed. Precedent accumulates. It becomes doctrine. It becomes the water in which institutions swim without noticing that it is water at all. The Second World War intensified everything about this dynamic, beyond what the First World War had established. Britain, in the early 1940s, was preparing for the real possibility of invasion, and the alterations made to official maps during that period were far more extensive and far more systematically organized than anything done during the earlier conflict. Road signs were removed from junctions across the country, making navigation difficult for any invader who got ashore. Place names were stripped from railway stations so that a disoriented soldier or spy would not know where he had arrived. And the Ordnance Survey itself was tasked with producing multiple parallel versions of its maps simultaneously, one stripped of sensitive detail for public distribution, and others retaining full information for military and government use. The existence of these parallel map series is documented fact, available in the archived records of the agency and in the published official histories that have been produced over the years. What is less discussed in those official histories, what has received almost no sustained mainstream historical attention, despite its significance to everything that followed, is that the category of sensitive detail removed from public maps during this period was not limited to military installations, industrial sites, and transport infrastructure. It also included, with a thoroughness that increased as the war progressed and as the reasons for it evolved beyond the straightforward, a substantial body of ancient and prehistoric sites across Britain. The official reason given for this particular removal was plausible on its face. Ancient earthworks, particularly prominent ones visible from altitude, could serve as navigational landmarks for enemy aircraft. A Luftwaffe pilot who had studied pre-war OS maps and memorized the layout of notable earthworks and ancient monuments could theoretically use those features to orient himself over blacked-out Britain at night or in poor visibility conditions. Certain landscape features, large geometric earthworks, prominent barrow mounds distinguishable from altitude, the distinctive silhouettes of hill forts along ridgelines, could in theory provide navigational reference points comparable to the river bends and railway junctions that were more obviously sensitive. And so the decision was made to reduce the information about such features that appeared on publicly available maps. It was presented as a temporary wartime measure, practical in its motivation, reversible when the threat passed. Like so many temporary wartime measures in the long history of emergency powers and their extraordinary afterlives, it did not end when the war did. By the time the war ended and the formal rationale for wartime restrictions had expired, the mapping decisions had already been reviewed, and a new rationale had been found for maintaining and extending them. The year 1950 stands as a significant marker in this story for reasons beyond the simple passage of 5 years since the war's end. By 1950, the Cold War had begun in earnest and was shaping British defence policy in fundamental ways. The Soviet Union had tested its first nuclear weapon in August 1949, a development that transformed the strategic calculus of British security from one focused on conventional military threats to one that had to account for the possibility of nuclear annihilation. The Korean War began in June 1950, demonstrating that the post-war world was not going to settle into the peaceful coexistence that some had hoped for. The entire context within which British defence and intelligence agencies operated had shifted fundamentally from the one that had produced the wartime mapping restrictions. The threat was no longer German invasion. The threat was now, in the minds of those responsible for British security, nuclear war, Soviet espionage, and the infiltration of British institutions by hostile intelligence services. And the mapping restrictions that had been introduced as wartime measures were not only maintained, but significantly expanded under the justification of this new and more permanent threat environment. What had been temporary became policy, and what had been applied, at least ostensibly, to modern military and industrial sites was extended quietly and without public debate or parliamentary oversight to cover an entirely different and much older category of location: ancient sites, prehistoric monuments, underground complexes of human origin that predated written history. The full landscape of a Britain that existed before the nations, that now claim it had names or borders or institutions of any recognizable kind. To understand why this extension happened, why the post-war security apparatus of Britain developed a sustained interest in prehistoric and ancient sites beyond what any conventional military concern would explain, you need to understand something that the official history of British archaeology in the post-war decades tends to pass over with some speed. The years from the mid-1940s through the late 1950s were a period of extraordinarily active official investigation of ancient sites across Britain. Not all of this investigation was conducted by university archaeologists under the auspices of respectable academic institutions with published results and peer-reviewed findings. A significant and poorly documented portion of it was conducted by, or conducted under the supervision of, government agencies whose primary interest in those sites was not scholarship. The wartime and immediately post-war years saw a large number of ancient sites across Britain subjected to what were officially classified as engineering surveys and ground assessments, terms broad enough to cover almost any kind of investigation without triggering public curiosity or parliamentary inquiry. Agricultural improvement schemes and land reclamation programs provided institutional cover for extensive earth-moving on ancient landscapes. Defence construction projects required ground surveys that, in their scope and methodology and in the equipment they deployed, went far beyond what was needed to build a radar installation or an airfield or a communications relay station. And the results of those investigations, whatever they found in those ancient fields and ancient earthworks and ancient underground spaces, went not into the academic literature or the public record, but into classified files that remain, to this day, either permanently sealed or quietly destroyed. The geography of post-war Britain makes this more concrete in useful ways. The British government, in the immediate post-war period, found itself in possession of enormous tracts of land that had been requisitioned for military purposes during the fighting and that were not returned to civilian use when peace came. Salisbury Plain, the largest area of chalk downland in Britain and the largest military training area in the United Kingdom, covering nearly 380 square kilometres of Wiltshire's ancient landscape, had been substantially expanded during the war. It was not returned to civilian use when the conflict ended. Instead, it was retained under military control and its use intensified as the Cold War requirements of the British Army developed. Stonehenge sits on the northern edge of Salisbury Plain, and the Stonehenge monument, as famous as it is only the most publicly visible element of an ancient landscape that extends for miles in every direction. That wider landscape is dense with earthworks, barrows, enclosures, avenues, pit alignments, and features of the ancient past that archaeologists are still cataloguing and still struggling to adequately explain. The military control of Salisbury Plain gave the government physical control over that landscape in a way that went far beyond anything achievable through cartographic omission alone. You cannot remove something from a public map and thereby prevent a determined walker from finding it on the ground. But you can remove it from the map and simultaneously fence off the land it sits on, restrict access so completely that most people never go near it, and ensure that any unofficial investigation of what is there encounters a very specific kind of official resistance. What lies on and under Salisbury Plain beyond the publicly acknowledged archaeology is a question that has occupied independent researchers and a minority of academic archaeologists for decades. The known monuments are genuinely spectacular, a concentration of prehistoric construction that represents one of the most significant achievements of human civilization in Northern Europe during the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. But the known monuments, the ones that appear in guidebooks and attract tourists and feature in every standard account of British prehistory, are not the complete story of what is there. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in recent years, some commissioned by heritage organizations and some by independent researchers working with equipment that did not exist 20 years ago, have revealed subsurface features on Salisbury Plain that do not appear in any official archaeological record. Extensive underground voids, chambers of uncertain origin and uncertain age, passages running beneath the chalk that, based on their depth, their geometry, and the way they appear in the radar data, seem to be human-made and seem to predate the Bronze Age constructions that sit above them on the surface. The official response to these findings has been carefully modulated and carefully managed. Some results have been acknowledged and incorporated into the ongoing record with the assurance that further study is needed and planned. Others have been met with a silence so complete and so sustained that the silence itself becomes a form of evidence about how the findings are being handled. Avebury in Wiltshire is the second great centre of prehistoric monumental construction in southern England, and by most measures of scale, it is even more remarkable than Stonehenge. The Avebury complex is the largest prehistoric stone circle in the world, not in terms of the height of its stones or the precision of their dressing, but in terms of the sheer area it encompasses. The circle surrounds and runs through the centre of the modern village of Avebury, so that houses and pubs and a National Trust shop sit inside a monument that was already ancient when the pyramids of Egypt were being planned. The wider landscape around Avebury includes Silbury Hill, the largest artificial prehistoric mound in Europe, the West Kennet Long Barrow on its chalk ridge 2 kilometres to the southeast, the Beckhampton Avenue and the West Kennet Avenue, long processional routes lined with paired standing stones that originally extended across many kilometres of the surrounding downland, and dozens of smaller monuments, enclosures, and earthworks that together form one of the most complex and carefully organised prehistoric landscapes anywhere on Earth. What appears on modern Ordnance Survey maps of this area, even at the most detailed scales available to the general public, is a selective and substantially reduced representation of the features that were present in this landscape and were documented in surveys conducted during the first half of the 20th century, before the post-war management of the cartographic record began in earnest. The courses of the stone avenues, as they extended beyond the areas now managed by the National Trust and English Heritage, are not marked on current maps. Features identified and carefully recorded during the early and mid-20th century that were subsequently destroyed or buried during agricultural improvement schemes are not marked even as historical features on the current cartography, as if acknowledging that something once existed, there would raise too many uncomfortable questions about what else might still exist and why the record has been reduced rather than maintained. The results of subsurface investigation from both official surveys and independent ground-penetrating radar surveys of the area, which are known to exist in archived form and whose existence has been confirmed by researchers who have seen the archive references even when they could not see the documents themselves, have not been published or made available through any formal access process. Silbury Hill is, in some ways, the single most eloquent individual piece of evidence for the argument that something significant is being carefully managed out of the public understandings of ancient British archaeology. It is 40 metres tall. It covers approximately 5 acres of ground. It sits in the flat landscape of the Kennet Valley with a presence that is difficult to fully communicate from photographs or from descriptions. A presence that people who visit it in person invariably describe as more powerful and more arresting than they expected. It was constructed roughly 4,500 years ago, making it roughly contemporary with the later phases of construction at Avebury, and somewhat later than the earliest phases of Stonehenge's development. And after more than 2 centuries of formal investigation, including tunnel excavations in the 18th century by the antiquary Richard Colt Hoare, elaborate Victorian excavations that did more damage than they revealed, and a major multidisciplinary investigation in the 1960s and 1970s involving archaeological teams under the direction of the BBC and Cardiff University, the official position of British archaeology on Silbury Hill remains that we do not know why it was built or what purpose it served. That position is not dishonest in the narrow technical sense. There is genuine academic uncertainty about the purpose of Silbury Hill and genuine scholarly debate among those who have dedicated careers to studying it. But the official position also functions to foreclose certain lines of inquiry, because the moment you take seriously the evidence that Silbury Hill's construction was far more sophisticated than a simple ceremonial heap of earth and chalk, the moment you follow the documented evidence of its internal structure and its spatial relationships with the other features of the surrounding landscape, you begin asking questions about what lies beneath it and what connects it underground to the other elements of the Avebury system. And those questions lead, with an uncomfortable directness, toward the areas of the evidence base that have been most thoroughly managed out of the public record. The tunnel investigations of Silbury Hill produced, across their several episodes over more than 2 centuries, a body of evidence that the published academic accounts of the site do not fully represent. The most recent major investigation, conducted between 2007 and 2008 by English Heritage, involved re-excavating and stabilizing an earlier tunnel driven through the hill during the Victorian period, work made necessary by structural concerns about the hill's stability after a collapse had opened a sinkhole in its surface. The published findings from that work acknowledged, more explicitly than earlier accounts had done, the complexity of the hill's internal construction. There are features within Silbury Hill that indicate its construction was carried out in multiple organized phases over a significant period of time, with careful engineering of drainage, structural loading, and material selection that demonstrates a level of technical knowledge and organized planning capacity that the conventional picture of Neolithic British society does not easily accommodate. What the published reports do not address, and what independent researchers who have worked through the full body of available documentation have noted with increasing frustration, is the complete scope of what the tunnel investigations encountered at their deepest levels, the chambers and voids and subsurface connections that some contemporary accounts describe, and that the formal published reports do not adequately account for. Those earlier investigators wrote reports. Those reports exist in archival form. The portions that have been made publicly available represent a selection from a larger body of material, and the basis on which that selection was made is not documented or explained in any published account. The West Kennet Long Barrow, sitting on its chalk ridge a short walk from Silbury Hill across the Kennet Valley, is one of the most accessible and most visited prehistoric sites in Britain. It is open without charge throughout the year, extensively photographed, and the subject of considerable published scholarship stretching back to the 19th century. Its forecourt and its 5 burial chambers, accessible from the southern facade of the Long Mound, are well documented in the academic literature and in the interpretive materials provided at the site. What is documented rather less thoroughly in the materials available to the general public is the extent of the underground footprint of the monument beyond those 5 known chambers, the nature and extent of the passages that appear to extend from the known chambers further into the chalk hillside, and the results of various ground-penetrating radar surveys of the surrounding ridge that have identified subsurface features whose existence is not accounted for by the visible monument or by the published archaeological record. The information about those surveys is known to exist in archived form. Freedom of information requests for access to that information have been refused on the grounds that disclosure would not be in the public interest, a determination whose application to an archaeological survey result in a Neolithic burial monument in a peacetime democratic society would require rather more explanation than it has ever received from the institutions that have made it. The pattern at Avebury, this combination of known above-ground complexity, managed interpretation, and restricted below-ground uncertainty, repeats itself across the ancient landscape of Britain with a consistency that cannot be attributed to coincidence or administrative accident. In Orkney, the northernmost of the island groups that form Scotland and the location of what is now recognised as one of the most significant concentrations of Neolithic monuments anywhere in the world, the situation follows a nearly identical template. The Ring of Brodgar, the Stones of Stennis, the Neolithic village of Salisbury, and the chambered cairn of Maeshowe together form the heart of Neolithic Orkney, inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in recognition of its outstanding universal significance. These monuments are extraordinary in their own right and have produced extraordinary scholarship, but they sit within a wider landscape of subsurface complexity that recent ground-penetrating radar surveys have begun to reveal, and what those surveys reveal is significantly more extensive than the official archaeological record had predicted. Some results have been published and have attracted significant academic interest and genuine media coverage. Others, including surveys conducted under official auspices during the mid-20th century in the context of various infrastructure and defence-related projects that touched the Orkney landscape, remain in archived form that is unavailable to independent researchers or available only in versions so heavily redacted that they communicate more about what is being protected than about what was found. Orkney was not a military priority in the same category as Salisbury Plain, but it was a theatre of intense military activity during both World Wars and the period between them. Scapa Flow, the great natural harbour at the heart of the Orkney archipelago, was the principal anchorage of the British Grand Fleet during the First World War, the site of the scuttling of the interned German High Seas Fleet in 1919, and a significant naval base during the Second World War. The construction and operation of military infrastructure across Orkney during those conflict years involved extensive ground surveys and earth-moving operations across the ancient landscape of the islands. What the surveys conducted in the context of that military activity found, beyond the naval and tactical information they were formally collecting, is not part of the published public record of Orkney archaeology. The academic archaeology of Orkney has produced remarkable results through excavation and survey conducted under scholarly auspices, but it has worked by necessity with the information available to it, and the information available to it has been shaped by the same post-war management of the cartographic and archival record that has affected the rest of Britain. The Scottish Highlands present a different and less visited dimension of the same problem. The concentration of standing stone sites, recumbent stone circles, chambered cairns, and the ancient earthworks in the Highlands is extraordinary and significantly underappreciated in comparison to the famous southern English monuments that attract the majority of research attention and tourist traffic. Many Highland sites are genuinely remote, reachable only on foot across terrain that is both beautiful and demanding, and as a result, they have been less thoroughly investigated than their more accessible counterparts in the south. But they have not been ignored by the official record. The post-war decades saw a significant program of aerial photography across the Highlands, conducted ostensibly for agricultural planning, land improvement assessment, and the management of the Highland estate system. And those aerial surveys documented features of the ancient landscape with an extraordinary and not always intentional thoroughness. The photographs from those surveys are held in various archives, some accessible and some not, some in institutions whose very existence was not publicly acknowledged for decades. The portions of those archives that have been made accessible reveal, even in their selected and edited form, features of the Highland landscape that do not appear in any publicly available cartographic record and that have not been the subject of any published academic investigation. The question of what the restricted portions of those archives contain is a question that Highland archaeologists and independent researchers have raised for decades without receiving a satisfactory answer. Wales adds yet another dimension to this investigation, and in Wales, the specific and documentable case of deliberate cartographic omission is perhaps the most concrete example of what this investigation has found across Britain as a whole. The Preseli Hills in Pembrokeshire, in the far southwest of Wales, are famous among archaeologists and in popular accounts of Stonehenge as the source of the blue stones that were transported over 200 miles from their quarries to form the inner circle and the altar stone setting of the Wiltshire monument. That transportation is one of the most extraordinary logistical achievements in all of British prehistory, implying an organizational capacity and a cultural motivation that conventional accounts of Neolithic Britain have struggled to adequately explain. The effort to understand it, to trace the route it took and understand the communities that organized and sustained it, has been one of the most active areas of archaeological research in Britain in recent decades. What that research has revealed is that the Preseli Hills themselves, the origin landscape of the Stonehenge bluestones, contain a concentration of ancient features that goes far beyond what appears on any publicly available map of the area. There are earthworks in the Preseli Hills that appear on pre-war Ordnance Survey maps and that do not appear on the post-war editions of those same maps. There are features identified in aerial surveys from the 1940s and 1950s that have never been formally incorporated into the public archaeological record. And there are areas of the Preseli Hills where, if you walk with a 19th century OS map in one hand and a current one in the other, features clearly visible on the ground and clearly marked on the historical map simply do not exist on the current official cartography. Independent researchers who have done exactly this kind of comparative work, walking the landscape with historical maps, have documented specific cases of removal and omission across dozens of sites in England, Scotland, and Wales. The methodology requires patience and physical effort, but is not technically complicated. You take an early Ordnance Survey map of an area known to be archaeologically significant. You walk the landscape it describes. You compare what is visible on the ground and what was marked on the historical map with what appears on a current OS map of the same area, and you note every discrepancy. There are many such researchers working independently across Britain, with varying degrees of rigor and record keeping, and what is striking about their collective findings is not any single dramatic discovery, but the extraordinary consistency of the pattern they identify. Ancient earthworks, particularly those associated with underground or subsurface features, consistently appear on historical maps and consistently fail to appear on maps produced after approximately 1950. The correlation is not perfect in every case, and there are features that appear on current maps that do not appear on older ones, because they were discovered after the older surveys were completed. But the overall direction of the trend, confirmed across enough sites and enough independent researchers to be statistically significant, is clear and has never been satisfactorily explained by the official institutions whose decisions produced it. The specific sites of the Rollright stones in Oxfordshire, the Men Antol in Cornwall, the Castlerigg stone circle in Cumbria, Arbor in Derbyshire, and the Long Man of Wilmington in East Sussex, each present their own versions of this pattern. At Rollright, the stone circle itself is marked on current maps, but the broader landscape of associated earthworks and subsurface features documented in early 20th century surveys is substantially absent from the current cartographic record. At Men Antol, the famous Hold stone that has given the site its name for centuries in Cornish folk tradition, the surrounding field system and the underground features identified in early surveys of the area appear in pre-war documentation, but not in post-war cartography. At Castlerig, the dramatic stone circle in its mountain-ringed basin in the Lake District is well documented and well visited, but the surrounding landscape's full complexity, including features identified in aerial surveys from the 1940s, is not reflected in any publicly available map or archaeological inventory. Below, the Derbyshire Henge monument, sometimes called the Stonehenge of the North for its impressive circular ditch and bank enclosing a stone setting, sits within a landscape that pre-war surveys documented as being significantly more complex than the current official record suggests. And at the Long Man of Wilmington, in Sussex, the enormous carved chalk figure on the hillside above the South Downs, debate about the figure's age and origin has been conducted in a context where the subsurface features of the surrounding hill have not been fully investigated or fully reported. The Cerne Abbas giant in Dorset, another of Britain's great chalk figures and one of the most recognizable elements of the ancient landscape to people who have never visited it in person, presents a similar puzzle of managed ambiguity. The giant, cut into the chalk hillside above the Dorset village, with a boldness and a confidence that communicates something of the culture that produced him, is one of the most recognized features of the ancient British landscape. The question of his dating and origin has been the subject of sustained archaeological debate, with suggestions ranging from a genuine prehistoric origin through a Roman period creation to a relatively recent medieval or early modern construction that may or may not reference something older. That uncertainty is genuine. The archaeological evidence for the giant's age is genuinely ambiguous, and reasonable scholars have reached different conclusions from the same evidence. But the investigation of the giant's age and context has been conducted in a framework where certain lines of investigation, specifically the investigation of the subsurface environment of the hill in which he is carved, have been less thoroughly pursued than the general interest in the question would seem to justify. The hill above Cerne Abbas, like the hills above many of Britain's chalk figures, contains underground features. Those features have been partially surveyed. The results of those surveys are in the archive. Their content remains unavailable through any formal access process. The chalk landscape of southern England, which stretches from Wiltshire and Dorset through the Hampshire Downs and the North and South Downs of Surrey and Sussex, and into the chalk hills of East Anglia, is the geological substrate of the most dramatic concentration of ancient monuments in Britain. It is also a landscape that is honeycombed with underground features of human origin, a fact that the public understanding of this landscape almost entirely fails to register. Flint mines of Neolithic age, cut deep into the chalk to extract the high-quality black flint nodules that were the primary industrial material of prehistoric Britain, are known across this entire landscape. Grimes Graves in Norfolk is the most famous and the only one that is formally accessible to the public as a managed heritage site, but it represents a type of site that was far more widespread across the chalk downland than the publicly available record suggests. The full extent of flint mining activity in the chalk landscape of southern and eastern England, based on the survey evidence that exists in archival form, is significantly larger and significantly more interconnected than what appears in any publicly available archaeological account. The connection between those ancient mining sites and the broader underground landscape they are part of, the natural and semi-natural cave systems, the chalk mine networks of later historical periods, and the features of genuinely uncertain age and origin that exist at the deeper levels of the chalk, is a connection that the public understanding of this landscape has never been given the information to fully make. Grimes Graves itself, the one flint mining complex that is publicly accessible and formally presented as a heritage site, is instructive in what it chooses to show and what it withholds. The complex in Norfolk contains over 400 individual mining shafts, shallow depressions in the surface of the ground, each representing a pit that was dug by Neolithic flint miners to reach the black flint layers deep in the chalk. One of these shafts has been excavated, stabilized, and made accessible to visitors. who can descend into it and see the radiating passages that were cut from the bottom of the shaft into the surrounding chalk to follow the flint seams horizontally. The experience is genuinely remarkable and genuinely moving, a direct encounter with the working environment of people who lived 4,000 years ago. What visitors are not told, what does not appear in the interpretive materials provided at the site, is the full extent of the underground connection between those 400-plus shafts. The gallery systems that link the individual pits form a complex and extensive underground network that the full body of 20th century survey data, some published and some restricted, shows to be significantly larger and more interconnected than the single accessible shaft would suggest. The surveys that establish this fuller picture of the site's underground extent exist in the archive. Their results have been incorporated into the academic literature selectively. The full picture of what Grimes Graves actually is underground has never been put before the public in accessible form. The relationship between underground ancient sites and the post-war British military adds another dimension of considerable significance. The British military has, throughout its long history, had a particular and sometimes intense interest in underground spaces. During the Second World War, the development of underground facilities for command, communications, ammunition storage, and civilian protection produced a subterranean military infrastructure of considerable extent beneath the British Isles, from the cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall to the network of underground factories beneath the Cotswold Escarpment, from the deep-level tube shelters of London to the dispersed command bunkers constructed across southern England in anticipation of the invasion that fortunately never came. A significant portion of that infrastructure was built in areas where prehistoric and ancient underground features already existed, not because the military was specifically seeking out ancient underground spaces, but because the same geological factors that made certain areas attractive to prehistoric people for underground construction. Primarily, the presence of soft, workable chalk and stable limestone that could support underground structures without extensive artificial reinforcement also made those areas attractive to 20th century military engineers facing essentially similar practical requirements. The result of this geological coincidence across millennia was that military construction activity in the wartime and post-war decades frequently intersected with, disturbed, and in some documented cases apparently made use of, underground features of ancient origin. The extent to which the military consciously incorporated pre-existing ancient underground spaces into its wartime and post-war underground infrastructure is not publicly documented, but there are accounts from official documents partially released under FOI processes and from the testimony of individuals who worked on or near these projects in various capacities that suggest such incorporation was not uncommon, and that the discovery of extensive ancient underground systems in areas selected for military underground development was a recurring feature of those projects, rather than a singular surprise. RAF Rudloe Manor in Wiltshire is the most extensively documented case of this intersection, and it has attracted more sustained independent research interest than almost any other site in Britain because of the remarkable combination of its wartime and post-war classified history with its geological and archaeological context. Rudloe Manor is a country house near the village of Box in Wiltshire, acquired by the Royal Air Force during the Second World War and developed as the headquarters of the underground communications and signals complex built into the limestone ridge that runs beneath Box Hill and the surrounding Cotswold Escarpment. The RAF tunnel complex was built into an existing network of quarry passages and natural cavities in the Oolitic limestone, expanded and fitted out for military communications purposes in the early years of the war, and used as a signals relay and communications hub throughout the conflict and in the immediate post-war period. The access to this underground complex was provided by the Box Tunnel, the extraordinary railway tunnel cut through Box Hill by Isambard Kingdom Brunel's engineers for the Great Western Railway in the 1830s and 1840s, which gave the military engineers of a century later their initial access point into the underground of the ridge. What those military engineers found when they began extending and developing the underground complex at Box and Corsham was an underground environment significantly more complex than what any simple reading of the site's history as a Bathstone quarry would have suggested. The limestone of Box Hill and the Corsham area is not simply a solid geological formation with passages cut through it. It is a layered system of stone deposits interspersed with clay beds and characterized by the presence of voids, some clearly natural in origin, some clearly human-made by quarrying at various periods, and some whose origin and age resist easy classification. The extraction of Bathstone, the warm golden limestone that built much of Georgian Bath and that has been quarried from this ridge for centuries, had created by the 20th century a subterranean environment of extraordinary extent. Miles of quarry passages on multiple levels, some long abandoned and partly collapsed, others still in active use at the time of the wartime development, formed a labyrinthine network beneath the surface of the ridge that the military engineers had to survey, assess, and work with or around. And within and beneath that network, at levels that predated any documented period of formal stone extraction, were features of older origin that the quarry workers who had encountered them over the centuries had generally treated as natural features and had not thought to document or report in any formal way. Rudloe Manor and its associated underground complex became, in the post-war period, one of the most significant and most carefully guarded classified facilities in Britain. Various accounts of its post-war functions exist, derived from partial FOI releases, the careful testimony of former personnel speaking at various levels of generality about their work there, and the deductive work of researchers piecing together information from multiple indirect sources over many years. What is consistently described across those accounts is an underground facility of considerable size and operational significance, staffed throughout the Cold War period and associated in its outer security perimeter with patterns of activity that local residents noticed and occasionally attempted to investigate or document. What is also described in the more circumspect accounts of people who worked in the underground complex is an underground environment that included features they were not responsible for, had not been told about in their operational briefings, and were explicitly discouraged from investigating or discussing, and with colleagues or outside contacts. The passages that predated the military development, the chambers that had not been cut by wartime engineers or pre-war quarrymen, the features of the deep underground environment that did not fit the official narrative of a wartime communications facility built to serve the needs of a 20th century military organization. The Burlington facility near Corsham, the enormous Cold War underground emergency government relocation complex that has now been partially declassified and opened to occasional public visits organized by a heritage conservation group, is the publicly acknowledged face of the military underground infrastructure in this part of Wiltshire. Burlington was designed and built in the 1950s to house the British government in the event of nuclear war, equipped with offices, communication systems, a BBC studio, an underground reservoir for fresh water storage, and accommodation for several thousand civil servants, ministers, senior military personnel, and essential support staff. Its existence was secret for decades, known only to those with a need-to-know clearance, its location occasionally rumoured in the press, but never confirmed. Its construction made extensive use of existing quarry passages in the Corsham stone mines, adapting existing civilian infrastructure to military purpose with the pragmatic flexibility that wartime necessity had established as standard practice and that the Cold War era continued to reward. The engineers who adapted those passages for Burlington's purpose encountered, as the Rudloe engineers had encountered a decade earlier, Features of the underground environment that did not fit the official account of what was there. Their reports on those features, written as part of the engineering assessment and site characterization process for the Burlington project, are in the archive. They are restricted. The limestone ridge from Box through Corsham and across the broader Cotswold escarpment above North Wiltshire is, in archaeological terms, one of the most remarkable and least studied features of southern England when considered in relation to its underground dimensions. The ridge has been inhabited continuously since at least the Mesolithic, occupied by some of the earliest farming communities in Britain during the Neolithic, and used as a source of high-quality building stone from prehistoric times through to the present day. The stratified evidence of quarrying activity over those thousands of years, layers upon layers of human extraction at different depths and using techniques appropriate to different periods, creates an underground environment where the archaeological sequence runs from almost modern at the uppermost levels through medieval and Roman and Iron Age and Bronze Age and Neolithic to, at the deepest and least accessible levels, features whose age and character, the restricted survey, results that exist in the archive have not been published in any form available to independent researchers. Alfred Watkins, the Herefordshire businessman and antiquarian, who in the 1920s proposed that the prehistoric monuments of Britain were linked by a system of straight overland alignments he called ley lines, is a figure whose work sits in an uncomfortable position relative to the academic mainstream. His findings have been simultaneously ridiculed by professional archaeologists and enthusiastically adopted by the more speculative end of the alternative history community, and the association of his name with ancient astronaut theories and various forms of mystical interpretation has made it professionally difficult for serious researchers to engage with his actual fieldwork. The truth about Watkins's contribution is more interesting than either the dismissal or the uncritical enthusiasm allows. What Watkins actually did in his methodical fieldwork across the landscapes of Herefordshire and beyond was document with considerable care the existence of straight alignments connecting ancient sites across the British landscape, alignments that connected standing stones, hill summits, ancient churches built on pre-Christian sacred sites, old crossroad positions, ancient trackways, and significant topographic features in patterns that he argued represented a coherent system of wayfinding and landscape organization of some sophistication. The academic mainstream dismissed his findings because the statistical methodology available in the 1920s was not adequate to establish whether the alignments he described were genuinely systematic or the product of the pattern recognition that human minds perform automatically on any sufficiently large dataset of distributed points. That methodological critique had genuine force in the 1920s. It has rather less force now when statistical tools adequate to the question are available, and when the application of those tools to the alignment data has produced results that the academic mainstream has generally been reluctant to engage with. What is relevant to this investigation is not the full debate about ley lines as a general phenomenon, but the specific finding that certain of the alignments Watkins and subsequent researchers identified, the most consistent and most statistically robust of the proposed straight tracks across the British landscape, correspond with underground features that have been identified in survey data that is not fully publicly available. The alignment, variously known as the Michael and Mary line or the Apollo-Athena alignment, or one of the most extensively studied of the proposed major lays, runs across southern England from the tip of Cornwall through Glastonbury, Avebury, and on toward the northeast, and it passes through, or very close to, a remarkable concentration of sites where subsurface investigation has identified features that do not appear in the public archaeological record. Whether this correlation is meaningful or coincidental is a question that would require the full survey data to properly assess. The full survey data is not available. That unavailability is itself part of the story. The Glastonbury landscape presents a particular version of the management problem. Glastonbury Tor, the remarkable conical hill rising from the Somerset Levels, with its ruined medieval tower on its summit, is one of the most visited and most photographed ancient sites in Britain. The terraces on the Tor, the set of narrow shelf-like ledges that spiral around its conical form and are visible from a distance to anyone who looks at the hill with attention, have been the subject of archaeological debate for decades. Some researchers have argued they are natural geological formations produced by differential erosion of the bedded rock. Others have argued they represent a deliberately constructed spiral pathway around the hill, engineered with considerable sophistication. The official position has moved cautiously in the direction of acknowledging that the terraces are at least partly the result of human modification of the natural landform. What the official position does not address, and what the restricted results of various ground investigation surveys of the Tor would need to be brought into consideration to address adequately, is the underground dimension of the Tor. Local tradition, documented from at least the medieval period in monastic and hagiographic sources, holds that the Tor contains a system of underground chambers and passages associated with the sacred significance of the hill. That tradition, consistent with the traditions associated with many of Britain's significant ancient hills, has been neither fully confirmed nor definitively refuted by the investigations that have been conducted. The relevant survey results exist in archived form. Their content remains unavailable through formal access channels. The Freedom of Information Act 2000 was introduced against a background of cross-party political consensus that the British state was excessively secretive and that the public had a legitimate right to greater access to information about how government decisions were made and what evidence those decisions were based on. The Act created a formal and legally enforceable right of access to information held by public bodies, subject to a defined list of specific exemptions, and established the Information Commissioner's Office as an independent regulatory body with the authority to adjudicate disputes between applicants and public bodies and to compel disclosure where refusals were found to be unjustified. In the years since the Act came into force, its application to questions about ancient sites and the history of cartographic management has produced a record that is instructive in both what has been released and what has been refused. A number of requests have been successful and have produced documents that confirm, in concrete and specific terms, the broad picture that comparative map analysis and archival research had already suggested. A request for internal correspondence between the Ministry of Defence and the Ordnance Survey relating to mapping decisions made in the 1950s and 1960s produced, after a review process that took significantly longer than the statutory deadline should have allowed, a set of documents confirming that the MOD was directly and routinely involved in decisions about what prehistoric and ancient features should appear on publicly available maps, and that the grounds for those decisions were not limited to the conventional military security considerations that the official account had always implied. The documents released in response to that request were substantially redacted, with significant portions blacked out before release. But what remained visible was sufficient to confirm the principle that independent researchers had been asserting for decades, and the pattern of redaction itself was informative, pointing with some precision toward the portions of the documents that the official reviewers considered too sensitive for public disclosure, even after 70 years. The LiDAR data that has been progressively made publicly available by the Environment Agency and the Archaeology Data Service represents a genuinely transformative development in the landscape archaeology of England, and its implications for the management of the public understanding of ancient Britain are still being worked out in real time. LiDAR, the laser scanning technology that maps the surface of the ground with millimeter-scale precision from low-flying aircraft, can see through vegetation cover that would conceal earthworks from conventional aerial photography or from ground-level observation. When LiDAR data is processed and displayed with appropriate illumination angles, the result is a map of the ground surface so detailed and so revealing that features invisible to the naked eye from the ground, features that would have passed unnoticed by generations of farmers, walkers, and even professional archaeologists, become dramatically and unambiguously visible. The application of publicly available LiDAR data to areas of known archaeological significance has produced, with remarkable consistency, evidence of far greater landscape complexity than the official archaeological record had predicted or acknowledged. Features that do not appear on any modern OS map, features that were not included in any heritage environment record, features that are not recorded in any published archaeological inventory, emerge from the LiDAR data with a clarity that makes their existence and their human origin undeniable. The Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes project, which used LiDAR and a range of other remote sensing technologies to survey the landscape, within a roughly 3-kilometre radius of Stonehenge in unprecedented detail, is the most prominent and widely publicised demonstration of what this approach can achieve. The project, conducted between 2010 and 2014 and announced to the world with considerable media fanfare in September 2014, identified 17 previously unknown monuments in the Stonehenge landscape, including large pit features that appear to have been dug in the Neolithic period, previously unknown enclosures of uncertain function and date, and evidence of a scale and complexity of ancient activity in the area around Stonehenge that significantly exceeds what the pre-LiDAR archaeological record had led researchers to expect. The findings were genuine and significant. The media coverage they received was substantial and largely accurate in its representation of what had been found. The project was widely and reasonably presented as an example of what modern technology, properly deployed and properly funded, could achieve in the investigation of Britain's ancient past. What attracted somewhat less attention in the media coverage, but was noted by researchers who studied the project's methodology and geographic scope in detail, was a specific and significant question about the boundaries of the survey. The Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes project covered the landscape within its stated survey area with impressive thoroughness and produced outputs of high technical quality. What it did not cover, and what its published materials do not address in any detail, are the areas of the Stonehenge landscape that lie within the boundaries of the military training land that surrounds a significant portion of the monument's landscape context. The survey boundary, in several directions from Stonehenge, coincides with a precision that is difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence with the boundaries of land under Ministry of Defence control. Within those boundaries, access for independent survey is restricted by the same authority that has been directly involved in decisions about what appears on public maps for over 70 years. What LiDAR survey of those restricted areas would reveal, if it were conducted and its results made publicly available, is a question whose answer currently exists in one form or another in the restricted archive. The citizen archaeology movement, the distributed community of independent researchers and enthusiasts who use publicly available LiDAR data, historical map archives available online, satellite imagery from commercial providers, and personal field observation to investigate the ancient landscape, has grown significantly in the past decade and represents a genuinely new dynamic in the relationship between the official management of information about the ancient past and the public's access to that past. The combination of accessible LiDAR data, historical maps now digitally available through the National Library of Scotland's excellent online map archive and through various other digitisation projects, satellite imagery at resolutions adequate for identifying substantial earthworks and landscape modifications, and the collaborative infrastructure of online forums and social media communities, has enabled a distributed approach to landscape archaeology that is, in important ways, outside the control of the official institutions that have historically managed information about the ancient landscape. Each year the community grows. Each year the number of sites where the discrepancy between historical and current mapping is documented and published, if only in informal online form, accessible to anyone interested enough to search for it, increases. And each year the gap between what the independently assembled evidence base shows and what the official account acknowledges becomes more visible and more difficult to bridge with the standard explanations about cartographic updating, the rationalization of older mapping conventions, and the correction of historical inaccuracies. The government's response to the body of research that has accumulated around these issues has evolved considerably over the decades. In the early post-war period, when the research community raising these questions was small, and the information infrastructure that now makes comparative landscape research so accessible to anyone with an internet connection did not exist, the response was largely one of simple non-engagement. The researchers who raised questions about cartographic omissions and archival restrictions were niche figures whose concerns did not reach the mainstream media or the mainstream academic discourse in any form that required a formal response. By the 1990s, as the internet began to enable the kind of distributed collaborative research that has since become standard practice in many fields, the response shifted toward more active engagement of a specifically managed kind. Official research projects were funded that produced significant findings in carefully bounded geographic areas, published to considerable public and academic acclaim, and that served the dual purpose of maintaining the official claim to be the responsible and thorough steward of the ancient landscape, while ensuring that the research remained within geographic and interpretive channels that could be managed by institutions with an interest in the outcome. The funding model for major archaeological research into ancient sites in Britain is itself a significant dimension of this story. Research of the scale and technical sophistication needed to properly investigate the most significant ancient sites and landscapes requires equipment, skilled personnel, legal access to land that is often privately or publicly restricted, and institutional support of a kind that independent researchers cannot provide for themselves. The bodies that provide that funding, primarily English Heritage and its successor organisation, Historic England, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and various charitable foundations whose trustees include individuals with backgrounds in government and the security services, exercise through their funding decisions a substantial degree of influence over what research is conducted, where it is conducted, how its results are framed for public communication, and which findings are treated as significant and which are treated as requiring further study before any public statement can be made. This is not unique to archaeology or to Britain. All research funding systems embed priorities that shape what gets studied and how it gets interpreted. But in the specific context of a research field where the government has a documented history of managing information for reasons that go beyond straightforward academic oversight, the concentration of research funding in bodies that are themselves part of or closely aligned with the government and its heritage management structures produces a structural tension that independent researchers and occasionally sympathetic insiders have identified and criticized without producing any substantial change in the system. The question that animates all of this research, the question that keeps people walking the landscape with old maps and boots and notebooks, spending late evenings cross-referencing LiDAR data with 19th century surveys and satellite imagery, filing freedom of information requests that they know are likely to be refused, and returning again and again to landscapes that the official record has decided are adequately understood, is not simply what is on the maps that should be there and is not. That question is interesting and important, but it is ultimately a bureaucratic one about the administration of the public record. The deeper question, the one that gives this investigation its real weight and its real urgency, is what the features that have been removed from the maps, what the underground structures and subsurface complexes and ancient earthworks whose existence has been managed out of the public understanding of British prehistory actually represent. What do they tell us about the people who made them, about the sophistication and the extent and the knowledge of the civilization or civilizations that produced them, and about the degree to which the conventional public account of British prehistory, the one that moves from hunter-gatherers to simple farmers to Bronze Age metalworkers in a comfortable and familiar linear progression, is adequate to the actual evidence of what is in the British landscape, above and below the surface. The conventional account of British prehistory is not wrong in its broad outlines, and this investigation is not an argument that it is. The sequence of human activity in Britain from the Paleolithic through to the Iron Age is reasonably well established in its general shape, and the academic consensus on the major phases of that sequence is the product of a century of serious, often excellent, and sometimes brilliantly original scholarship. But the conventional account, in its publicly available and publicly presented form, is an account built primarily from what is known from excavated sites, from surface surveys, from the analysis of portable material culture, and from the interpretation of the visible landscape. It is an account that gives relatively little weight to underground evidence, that has not fully incorporated the implications of the underground features that have been partially investigated, and that operates within a framework of assumptions about the scale and sophistication of prehistoric British civilization, that the restricted evidence, if it were available, might significantly challenge. The scale of Silbury Hill, to return to that example one more time, is not easily reconciled with the idea that it was produced by the kind of small-scale, locally organized farming communities that the conventional account of Neolithic Britain posits as the standard social unit of the period. The engineering of Silbury Hill, the careful layering of different geological materials in an engineered sequence that manages drainage and structural integrity, the mathematical precision of its conical form, the management of the construction process that has kept it standing intact for 4,500 years, with relatively little subsidence or deformation, points to a level of organized social effort and technical knowledge that the conventional picture of Neolithic Britain does not easily accommodate. Similar arguments applied to the stone circles, whose accurate astronomical alignments required precise observational knowledge and precise engineering, to the avenue systems, whose straight courses maintained over miles of undulating landscape required surveying techniques of considerable sophistication, and to the alignment systems that connect distant monuments across the British landscape with a precision that implies both a sophisticated understanding of geometry and a social organization capable of maintaining coherent intentions across very large distances and very long periods of time. The conventional account manages these incongruities by emphasizing the time over which the constructions were carried out, the gradual accumulation of effort over many generations, and the possibility that the organizational capacity of prehistoric societies was greater than their surviving material culture might suggest. All of that is true as far as it goes. It does not fully resolve the puzzle. And the puzzle becomes considerably more challenging when you add to it the subsurface evidence that the official account has not incorporated because it has not been released. The underground dimensions of sites like Silbury Hill, like the West Kennet Long Barrow, like the chalk mines of Grimes Graves, and like the dozens of sites across Britain where survey evidence indicates the presence of subsurface features not accounted for by the visible monuments, suggest a prehistoric engagement with the underground environment that goes well beyond what is publicly acknowledged. The underground in the conventional account of British prehistory is represented primarily by burial chambers in the known long barrows and chambered cairns, by flint mines at Grimes Graves and a handful of other sites, and by occasional pit features associated with ritual or economic activity. The evidence that has been gathered and restricted suggests that this representation is significantly incomplete, and that the engagement of prehistoric British cultures with the underground environment was more extensive, more systematic, and more technically sophisticated than the public record shows. What the full extent of that engagement was, what purposes the underground features served beyond the burial of the dead and the extraction of raw materials, and what relationship those underground features had to the visible monuments above them, are questions that the restricted archive would need to be opened to properly answer. The reasons why the British government might want to restrict information about subsurface archaeological features are, in most cases, not in themselves mysterious. Military tunnelling and underground communications infrastructure, built in areas where ancient underground spaces exist, creates legitimate security concerns about the disclosure of the extent and connectivity of those underground systems. Underground spaces used by classified facilities cannot be publicly documented without compromising the security of those facilities. Survey results that reveal the existence of underground passages in areas of strategic importance have a legitimate claim to restriction under defence exemptions. All of that is defensible in principle. The problem is that the legitimate grounds for restriction in some cases appear to have been applied so broadly, and in some cases so obviously beyond their legitimate scope, that they function less as specific security measures protecting identifiable current interests and more as a general suppression of evidence about the underground archaeology of Britain, maintained across multiple changes of government and administration, over a period long enough that many of the specific concerns that originally motivated the restrictions no longer exist in any recognizable form. The ancient sites of Britain are extraordinary. Stonehenge and Avebury and Salisbury and the Ring of Brodgar and the Long Man of Wilmington and Silbury Hill and the long barrows of the Cotswold Escarpment and the stone circles of Dartmoor and the hill forts of Wales and the recumbent stone circles of Aberdeenshire and the chambered cairns of the Hebrides and the thousands of smaller, less famous, less visited monuments that dot the British landscape from the Cornish coast to the Orkney Islands are the products of minds and hands and organised communities whose sophistication and ambition and knowledge we are only beginning to appreciate in their full dimensions. They built for the ages, in stone and earth and chalk and timber, and their constructions have survived for thousands of years in the landscape, because they were engineered with a care and a competence that we have consistently underestimated. The conventional account of who they were and what they knew and what they built is impressive in its scope and in the quality of the scholarship that has produced it. The evidence that the conventional account is incomplete, that there is more to the story of ancient Britain than the publicly available record shows, is not speculative. It is documented, and the documented evidence that the incompleteness of the conventional account is a managed incompleteness, shaped and maintained by deliberate decisions made by people in positions of authority over the public record of the British landscape, decisions made without public consultation, without parliamentary oversight, and without any commitment to eventual transparency, is the most significant and the most troubling finding that emerges from this investigation. We do not know what the British government found when it surveyed the ancient landscape of Britain in the wartime and post-war decades with instruments and resources that no academic archaeologist of the time possessed. We do not know what is in the sealed files and the restricted archives and the classified survey results that researchers have spent decades trying to access through every legal channel available to them, with frustratingly incomplete success. We do not know what features of the ancient British landscape were considered sensitive enough to require removal from the maps that the public uses to understand the territory they live in and to navigate the landscape they have inherited. What we know is that something was found, that a decision was made to restrict knowledge of it, and that the restriction has been maintained with considerable determination and considerable institutional consistency for over 70 years. Across many changes of government, many reorganizations of the agencies involved, and many moments when the justification for continuing the restriction must have been difficult to articulate in terms that any outside observer would have found fully convincing. The landscape of ancient Britain, whatever its full story turns out to be, has been decided by those with authority over its official record to be too important, or too complicated, or too challenging to the version of the past that the public is expected to hold, to be shared completely and honestly with the people who live above it and walk across it, and who, in the quieter and more contemplative moments that ancient sites reliably produce in almost everyone who visits them, sense something of the depth and the strangeness of what lies beneath their feet. The investigation continues. The LiDAR data is public. The historical maps are increasingly accessible. The community of independent researchers is growing and becoming more methodologically sophisticated. The FOI requests keep arriving, and occasionally they produce something, a fragment, a hint, a document whose redactions are not quite complete enough to hide everything the reviewer intended to hide. The truth about the ancient landscape of Britain is not entirely hidden. It is there in the data, in the comparison between what was mapped and what is mapped now, in the ground-penetrating radar results that heritage organizations commission and selectively publish, in the testimony of the people who have walked those restricted landscapes and seen what is there before the official silence closed around it. It is recoverable. The work of recovering it, of reassembling the full picture from the fragments, that the management of the public record has not been able to completely suppress, is one of the most important investigations of the current century. The ancient people who built these landscapes built them to last. The least we owe them is the honesty to look at all of what they built. The Defence, Press and Broadcasting Advisory Committee, historically known by the simpler name of the D-Notice Committee, is the body most often cited in discussions of official media and information restriction in Britain, and it is relevant to this investigation in ways that go beyond the obvious connection between official secrecy and cartographic management. D-Notices, formerly known today as Defence and Security Media Advisory Notices, are requests issued to British media organisations asking them not to publish information on specified grounds of national security. They are formally voluntary in the legal sense, meaning that media organisations are not legally required to comply with them. But in practice, they function as effective restrictions because the alternative to voluntary compliance is the threat of prosecution under the Official Secrets Act, a threat that the history of British media law has demonstrated to be more than theoretical. The D-Notice system is relevant to this investigation, not because D-Notices have been issued that specifically and explicitly cover ancient sites and prehistoric monuments, though evidence suggests that guidance has been issued covering certain categories of underground location in ways that effectively include ancient sites within their scope, but because it illustrates the broader architecture of information management, within which the cartographic and archival restrictions discussed throughout this investigation operate. The government does not need to make information illegal to access if it can make the accessing of it professionally risky, institutionally uncomfortable, and socially associated with the kind of alternative history community whose credibility problems make the association itself a disincentive. The Official Secrets Act, in its various iterations from the original 1889 legislation through to the current 1989 version, creates a legal framework within which a remarkably broad range of information about government activity can be classified and restricted without the public being told that a classification has taken place, without the public being told what category of information has been classified, and without any requirement that the classification be periodically reviewed or justified. The 1989 version of the Act, which governs current practice, removed the public interest defence that had existed in earlier versions. Under that earlier framework, it was at least theoretically possible to argue in court that a disclosure of classified information was justified by the public interest in the information being known. The 1989 Act removed that possibility. Information is restricted, and disclosing it is a criminal offence, regardless of whether the restriction serves any demonstrable current national security purpose, and regardless of how many decades have passed since the original classification was made. That legal framework creates the conditions under which information about ancient sites, if it has at any point been classified, can be maintained in classification indefinitely and without any legal mechanism that would force reconsideration. The relationship between the British government and the landscape of ancient Britain was not always one of concealment and management. In the 19th century and into the early 20th century, the official attitude toward prehistoric monuments was, in its own peculiar way, remarkably engaged. The Ancient Monuments Protection Act of 1882 was the first piece of legislation anywhere in the world specifically aimed at preserving prehistoric and ancient monuments against destruction, an act of legislative foresight that reflected a genuine official concern with the survival of the ancient landscape. The state took on a formal responsibility for the care and documentation of ancient monuments, a responsibility that the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of England, Scotland, and Wales, established in 1908, was created specifically to discharge. That work, conducted by dedicated and often brilliant individuals across the opening decades of the 20th century, produced remarkable records, meticulous surveys, detailed photographs, and carefully reasoned descriptions of what was found in the ancient landscape across Britain. And then the war came, and everything changed, and the relationship between the state and the ancient landscape was transformed into something quite different from the scholarly and stewardship-oriented engagement that the 19th century legislative tradition had imagined. The Royal Commission's records, now held primarily in the Historic England Archive, represent one of the most significant archaeological datasets in the world by any reasonable measure. They include material from surveys conducted across the entire 20th century, including surveys conducted during and immediately after the Second World War, in circumstances that gave the Commission access to areas and resources that peacetime scholarship would not have provided. Not all of that material is publicly available, and the restrictions on access are not uniformly applied or consistently explained. The archive holds restricted items whose existence is formally acknowledged but whose content is withheld. The stated reasons for restriction vary from item to item. Some material is restricted on the grounds that it includes personal information about identifiable living individuals. Some is restricted on the grounds of ongoing sensitivity, whose nature is not specified. Some is restricted with no reason, given beyond the application of a standard restriction period that has not yet expired. The standard restriction period for sensitive government records is 30 years. Records from the 1940s and 1950s should, on a 30-year standard, have become available for public access decades ago. Some of them have. Many of them have not, and the extensions of restriction that have been applied to them have not been publicly justified in any form that would allow independent assessment of whether the justification is adequate. The Somerset Levels, the low-lying wetland landscape of Somerset between the hills of the Mendips and the Quantocks, are perhaps the most dramatically rich and most dramatically underappreciated component of the ancient British landscape, in terms of what they contain and what the management of knowledge about them has suppressed. The levels are a peat environment, and peat preserves organic materials with an extraordinary thoroughness that the chalk and limestone landscapes of the uplands cannot match. Where the chalk landscape of Wiltshire has preserved the stone and chalk elements of the ancient built environment, the Somerset Levels have preserved wood, leather, plant material, and human tissue in a state of completeness that gives us access to an ancient world in 3 dimensions. The Sweet Track The wooden causeway, dated to approximately 3800 BCE, discovered in the 1970s during commercial peat extraction, is the most famous product of the Somerset Levels preservative properties and remains one of the most remarkable individual archaeological discoveries in British history. But it is far from the most complete picture of what the levels contain. Surveys of the peat deposits, conducted across the 20th century under various official and semi-official auspices, have identified numerous other ancient trackways, settlement platforms, fish traps, boats, ritual deposits, and landscape features at various depths in the peat sequence. Not all of the survey results from those investigations have been published. Not all of the material recovered from the levels has been analysed and reported, and the subsurface mapping of the levels that would be necessary to properly understand the extent and the distribution of the ancient landscape beneath the modern agricultural surface has never been made fully public in the form of a comprehensive and accessible record. The Glastonbury Lake Village, discovered in 1892 by Arthur Bullid and excavated over the following years, was one of the great archaeological discoveries of the Victorian era. A late Iron Age settlement built on artificial island platforms in the wetland, it produced an extraordinary collection of everyday objects from the last centuries BCE, preserved by the anaerobic conditions of the peat that gave archaeologists an unprecedented window into the material culture of late prehistoric Britain. The excavation of the lake village produced not only objects, but detailed records of the settlement's structure, its surrounding landscape, and the features of the wider wetland environment in which it sat. Some of those records, including the detailed survey maps of the surrounding landscape features that Bullid's team produced, have not been fully published or made accessible. They exist in archived form. The archive reference is known. Access has been requested and refused. The grounds for refusal are not those that most people would expect to apply to Victorian-era archaeological fieldwork notes. The connection between the Glastonbury landscape and the broader pattern of post-war information management around ancient sites is not straightforward, and it would be a mistake to apply the same framework wholesale to Victorian discoveries as to the post-war investigations. But the convergence of patterns across multiple sites, multiple time periods, and multiple administrative contexts suggests that the management of information about certain categories of ancient site has a depth and a consistency that goes beyond what any single institutional decision or any single moment of wartime emergency can explain. It is a pattern that has been actively maintained and actively extended across the entire post-war period by successive governments of different political characters, and its maintenance across that breadth of political and institutional change suggest either an inertia so deep that it has become invisible to those perpetuating it, or a continuing positive decision that the information being managed is important enough to justify the consistent effort of managing it. The independent researchers who have pursued these questions most persistently over the past several decades have done so at personal and professional cost that deserves acknowledgement. The institutional archaeology of Britain is not a community that welcomes challenges to the official account from outside its own ranks, and the researchers who have raised documented questions about cartographic manipulation, archival restriction, and the management of public understanding of the ancient landscape have generally found themselves dismissed or marginalized by the professional community whose cooperation they needed to pursue their work effectively. The characterization of these researchers as cranks or conspiracy theorists, while sometimes justified in specific cases where documented observation has been combined with interpretive frameworks that go far beyond what the evidence supports, has been applied too broadly and too reflexively, serving as an institutional mechanism for dismissing legitimate documentary research along with less rigorous work by association. The task for anyone trying to understand this area with the intellectual honesty it deserves is to separate what is documented from what is inferred, to acknowledge what the evidence actually shows without either overstating its implications or pretending it does not exist, and to hold the unanswered questions open as genuinely unanswered rather than either answering them prematurely with dramatic conclusions or dismissing them because the process of answering them is institutionally uncomfortable. The international context matters here, and it matters in ways that are sometimes overlooked in accounts that focus exclusively on Britain. The management of information about underground ancient sites is not a uniquely British phenomenon. It is a feature of the post-war security state that appears in various forms and with various local characteristics across multiple countries, whose governments conducted extensive surveys of their territories in the wartime and Cold War periods. Malta, the small Mediterranean island whose prehistoric archaeology is in certain respects even more remarkable than Britain's when considered in relation to its size, presents a case that has attracted considerable independent research and considerable official resistance to transparency. The Maltese temple complexes, built between roughly 3600 and 2500 BCE, are among the oldest freestanding stone structures in the world and represent a level of architectural sophistication that continues to generate genuine academic debate about the organizational capacity of the societies that produce them. The Hypogeum at Halsaflieni, a subterranean complex of chambers and passages cut from the limestone of Malta's surface during the same period, discovered in 1902, investigated in the early 20th century, and subsequently managed as a heritage site with very limited and carefully controlled public access, is the most famous underground ancient site in the world that most people know very little about. The restrictions on access to the Hypogeum, the restrictions on independent research within it, and the restrictions on publication of various survey results from 20th century investigations of it have been the subject of sustained independent criticism. Malta was a British military territory for over a century and a half, British control ending only in 1964. The interest of British military and intelligence services in the underground archaeology of Malta during the period of their authority over the island followed a pattern that researchers familiar with the British domestic situation find immediately recognizable. Turkey, specifically the area around Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Anatolia, provides perhaps the most dramatically illustrative international case. Göbekli Tepe, the extraordinary complex of carved stone circles dating to approximately 9600 BCE, is now publicly known as the world's oldest monumental structure and has forced a significant revision of the conventional understanding of when organized monument building began in human history. What is less widely known is that the site had been noted in surveys conducted in the 1960s, identified as significant by a German-American archaeological team, and then effectively left without further investigation for 3 decades, a gap in research activity whose explanation, involving the intersection of Cold War politics, Turkish military sensitivity about the region, and the particular interests of the institutions that controlled access to the site, has never been fully and publicly accounted for. When excavation finally began under Klaus Schmidt in 1994, what emerged was a site so far outside the conventional understanding of prehistoric human capability that its implications are still being worked through by the academic community. The 30-year gap between initial identification and serious investigation, a gap during which the site was known to be significant and was not investigated, is a pattern that will be familiar from this investigation's account of the British case. What the evidence shows, assembled across all of these sites, all of these documented cases, all of these comparative analyses of historical and current mapping, and all of the testimony and documentary material that has emerged through decades of FOI requests and archival research and independent fieldwork, is this. The British government has, since the Second World War, systematically managed the public understanding of its ancient landscape. That management has taken the form of removing information from public maps, restricting access to survey results in official archives, shaping the interpretation of ancient sites through the funding and framing of official research, and maintaining across 7 decades and multiple changes of government a consistent policy of limiting what the public is told about the underground dimensions of ancient Britain. The management has been concentrated on an underground and subsurface features, on sites in areas subject to military control, and on features identified in wartime and post-war official surveys, whose full results have not entered the public domain. The legal framework that enables this management is robust. The institutional architecture that maintains it is deep, and the body of information that has been withheld represents the missing dimension of a picture of the ancient past that the British public has been looking at in its incomplete form for over 70 years. What the restricted information would reveal, if it were released, is a question whose answer is genuinely uncertain in its specifics, but whose general direction is suggested by the pattern of what has been restricted. The features most consistently removed from maps and restricted in the archive are underground features of ancient origin, features that do not fit neatly into the conventional account of what prehistoric British civilization built and where and why. The implication is that what has been restricted is information that would challenge the conventional account in some significant way, information whose public availability would raise questions that the official institutions responsible for managing public understanding of the ancient past have not been prepared to address. Whether those questions would, if addressed with full information, lead to conclusions that are merely surprising or genuinely revolutionary in their implications for how we understand the human past is a question that cannot be answered from outside the restricted archive. It is, however, a question that is now more urgently asked by more people with better tools and better access to the partial evidence that is available than at any previous point in the 7 decades since the management began. The stones are still standing, the earthworks are still there, still visible to anyone who walks the landscape with open eyes and a historical map in hand. The chalk of southern England still holds whatever it holds in its ancient underground spaces. The limestone of the Cotswold Escarpment still contains the features that the wartime engineers found and the post-war administrators decided not to discuss. The peat of the Somerset Levels still preserves whatever lies at its deepest levels. The LiDAR data is public. The historical maps are online. The community of researchers is growing. The FOI system, imperfect as it is, continues to produce fragments of the hidden record. The work continues, and it will continue, because the question of what the ancient landscape of Britain actually contains, fully and honestly and completely, is not a question that goes away, simply because the official institutions responsible for answering it have preferred silence to transparency for 70 years. The ancient people who built this landscape built it to last. The work of understanding what they built, all of what they built, is the obligation of every generation that inherits it. That obligation has not yet been discharged. There is a specific moment in British cartographic history that researchers who study this subject consistently return to as the clearest single illustration of what happened and when it began in earnest. In 1946, the Ordnance Survey undertook a comprehensive revision of its 1-inch to the mile mapping series. The scale at which most members of the public accessed detailed geographic information about Britain before the age of digital mapping. The revision was presented to the public, and in the general history of cartographic practice, it has been treated as a straightforward modernization exercise, updating the maps to reflect post-war conditions, incorporating the changes to the built environment that the war and the post-war reconstruction had produced, and rationalizing the cartographic conventions that had accumulated over decades of incremental revision. That modernization rationale is not false. There was genuine cartographic rationalization in the post-war revision. But there was also, embedded within and executed under the cover of that revision, a systematic and deliberate reduction in the information provided about ancient and prehistoric sites across the mapped territory of Britain. Features that had appeared on the pre-war editions of those maps, features whose cartographic presence had been a matter of factual record for decades, or in some cases for well over a century, were removed from the post-war editions without any public explanation, without any announcement, and without any mechanism by which members of the public who noticed the removals could inquire about them. The removal was quiet, it was thorough, and it was, as the documentary record now makes clear, deliberate rather than inadvertent. The decision to conduct the revision in the way it was conducted was made not by cartographers responding to technical requirements, but by a committee whose membership included representation from the Ministry of Defence and from bodies whose relationship to archaeological matters was not one of scholarly preservation. The minutes of that committee, or the portions of them that have been made available through FOI requests, show that discussions about what should and should not appear on the revised maps explicitly addressed the question of ancient sites, that decisions were made on grounds that the committee minutes describe in terms that clearly indicate security and access concerns rather than cartographic or scholarly ones, and that the Ordnance Survey's own cartographic staff expressed, in at least some documented instances, reservations about the nature and the scope of the removals they were being asked to implement. Those reservations were noted, they were not acted upon. The revised maps went out with the removals intact. The experience of field researchers who noticed the discrepancies between the pre-war and post-war maps and attempted to investigate them through official channels in the years following the 1946 revision is documented in the correspondence of several individuals who became long-term researchers on this subject. The consistent experience of those researchers, writing to the Ordnance Survey, to the Ministry of Works, which at that time had responsibility for ancient monuments, and to the Royal Commission on Ancient and Historical Monuments, was that their inquiries were received without hostility, but were answered in terms that acknowledged the discrepancies without explaining them, offered reassurances that the omitted features remained part of the official record in appropriate internal form, and declined to provide any information about why the features had been removed from the publicly available maps or what the appropriate internal record actually showed. That response, which combined formal courtesy with substantive non-disclosure, is recognizable as the characteristic mode of official engagement with inconvenient questions in mid-20th century Britain. It is not the response of an institution that has made an error and is covering it up. It is the response of an institution that has been given instructions and is implementing them while keeping the nature of those instructions as opaque as possible. The phenomenon of ancient sites that appear on 19th century and early 20th century OS maps disappear from post-war editions and reappear when LiDAR data is analyzed is documented with sufficient frequency. Now that it has become a recognized research phenomenon within the community of independent landscape researchers, even if it has not been formally named or systematically catalogued, individual researchers have documented this pattern at sites in Wiltshire, in Dorset, in Suffolk, in Yorkshire, in the Welsh Marches, in Perthshire, and in Caithness. The sites vary in their character, ranging from substantial earthwork complexes to individual mound features, from stone settings of modest scale to extensive enclosure systems, from features that were clearly visible on the ground when the historical maps were made and that are still visible on the ground today to features that have been removed or obscured in the intervening period by agricultural activity. What all of the documented cases share is the pattern of historical cartographic presence, post-war cartographic absence, and ground or LiDAR evidence of actual physical existence. The question of who, specifically and individually, made the decisions about which sites to remove from public maps is one that the available documentation does not fully answer. The committee, whose minutes have been partially released, shows collective decision-making rather than individual authorship. The Ordnance Survey's own internal records of the revision process, to the extent that they have been made available, show the removals as implemented decisions rather than as decisions in the making. The correspondence of the Ministry of Defence officials who participated in the revision process has not been made available, and the individuals who were personally involved in those decisions are, in the overwhelming majority of cases, no longer alive to be asked about them. What can be documented is the institutional process, the pattern of decisions, and the results of those decisions in the form of the cartographic record that the post-war revision produced. The individual human story of the people who did this, who looked at the maps that showed Britain's ancient landscape in its full complexity and decided what should be hidden from the public, is a story that the archive holds but has not released. The aftermath of the 1946 revision established a pattern that subsequent revisions of the OS mapping series continued and extended. The 1960s revision, which produced the maps that generations of British walkers and outdoors enthusiasts grew up with, and which many people of a certain age still think of as the authoritative representation of the British landscape, incorporated further removals and further reductions in the information available about ancient sites. Those removals were again executed without public announcement and again under the formal cover of cartographic rationalization and modernization. The 1970s transition to metric mapping, which produced the 150,000 Land Ranger series that remains the standard walking map scale today, was another opportunity for the management of cartographic information about ancient sites. And the record of what appears on the Land Ranger series compared to what appeared on the earlier inch-to-the-mile maps it replaced shows further reductions in the representation of ancient landscape features in areas that have been identified in this investigation as of particular interest. The heritage environment records, the database systems maintained by local planning authorities and Historic England that are supposed to provide a comprehensive inventory of all known archaeological sites and monuments across England, are the contemporary successors to the cartographic representation of the ancient landscape that the OS maps provided. They are digital rather than cartographic, more detailed in their individual site records, and nominally accessible to the public through the National Heritage List for England. What the heritage environment records contain and what they do not contain is a question that follows directly from the pattern identified in this investigation. The records are comprehensive and detailed for the sites they include. The question is whether they include all of the sites that the 20th century surveys identified. The answer, based on comparisons between the survey data that has been partially released and the content of the heritage environment records for the same areas, is that they do not. There are sites in the LiDAR data, there are sites in the partially released survey results, there are sites in the pre-war OS maps that are not in the heritage environment records. The discrepancy is systematic rather than random. It follows the same pattern of concentrated omission around underground and subsurface features that characterizes the cartographic management identified throughout this investigation. The experience of the independent archaeologist and the amateur fieldworker who attempts to use the heritage environment records as a starting point for landscape research in areas of known archaeological significance is an instructive one. The records provide a solid, and in many cases, excellent starting point for understanding the known and formally recorded archaeology of an area. But the experienced field researcher who then walks the landscape that the records describe will, in certain areas, consistently find that the landscape on the ground is more complex than the records suggest, and that the additional complexity, the earthworks and mounds and subsurface features that the records do not include, clusters in the same areas, around the same categories of site, and in the same geographic contexts that the historical cartographic management also concentrated on. The convergence of these independent lines of evidence, the historical maps, the restricted archives, the heritage environment records, and the evidence of the landscape itself, toward a consistent picture of systematic managed omission is not the product of any single source or any single interpretive decision. It is the product of a body of evidence whose different components, assembled from sources as diverse as Victorian field surveys and 21st century LiDAR data and partially released FOI documents and the testimony of researchers who walked restricted landscapes decades ago, point in the same direction with a consistency that the conventional explanation of cartographic rationalization and the normal processes of archaeological recording cannot accommodate. The Archaeological Survey of Britain from the air, which began in earnest in the years following the First World War when the combination of available aircraft and trained observers who had spent the war looking down at the ground from altitude produced a generation of researchers with both the means and the habits of aerial observation, represents another dimension of the evidence base that has been partially managed and partially restricted. Aerial archaeology, the use of photographs taken from aircraft to identify features of the ancient landscape, is one of the most powerful tools that 20th century scholarship brought to the investigation of ancient Britain. Features that are invisible on the ground, buried under centuries of ploughing or hidden by vegetation, can become dramatically visible in aerial photographs when appropriate conditions of light, season, soil moisture, and crop growth combine to reveal them. The work of pioneers like O.G.S. Crawford and G.W.G. Allen in the 1920s and 1930s produced a revolution in the understanding of the extent and the complexity of the ancient British landscape, identifying thousands of sites that had no presence in the ground-level record. Their photographs, now archived in the Ashmolean Museum and elsewhere, remain one of the most important records of the pre-war state of the ancient landscape, and are a crucial reference point for the comparative analysis that identifies post-war cartographic management. What the wartime and immediate post-war years added to this resource was aerial photography of incomparably greater geographic coverage and technical quality, conducted from aircraft that could fly higher, faster, and more precisely than the pre-war pioneers had access to, by observers and photographers with wartime training in the systematic documentation of everything visible from altitude. The scale of wartime aerial photography of Britain, conducted for both offensive and defensive military purposes, covered the entire territory of the islands with a thoroughness and a resolution that no pre-war program had approached. That photography documented the ancient landscape of Britain in unprecedented detail, revealing features that the pre-war pioneer work had missed and confirming features that it had identified. The archive of that wartime photography is enormous and largely inaccessible. The portions of it that have been made available for archaeological research are a fraction of the whole, selected by processes whose criteria have not been publicly explained. The portions that remain inaccessible include, based on the pattern of what has and has not been released, precisely the areas and the categories of feature that this investigation has consistently found to be the focus of official management. The relationship between the Wartime Aerial Photography Archive and the decisions made in the 1946 revision of the Ordnance Survey maps is direct and documentable. The revision committee had access to the wartime photography. The photography showed them, with a clarity that no previous generation of mapmakers had enjoyed, the full extent of the ancient landscape of Britain, including features that had never appeared on any public map and features that appeared on pre-war maps, but whose scale and complexity the photography revealed to be much greater than the maps had suggested. The decisions about what should appear on the post-war public maps were made in full knowledge of what the wartime photography showed. The decision to remove certain categories of feature from those maps was made against a background of more complete information than had ever before been available to the people making cartographic decisions. The removal was not the product of ignorance, it was the product of knowledge, specifically of the kind of knowledge that produces a decision that the public does not need to share it. Researchers who have spent years working in this area consistently report a particular experience when they encounter the moment at which the available evidence most clearly demonstrates the gap between what was known and what was shared. It is not an experience of dramatic revelation in the sense that popular accounts of discovery often describe. It is an experience more like recognizing, in a set of administrative documents and archival references and cartographic comparisons, the shape of a decision that was made by specific people in specific institutional contexts for reasons that the documents allow you to infer but do not explicitly state. It is the experience of understanding that the ancient landscape you have spent years trying to document and understand has been seen before, seen clearly and completely, by people who then decided that you and everyone like you should not see the same thing. That experience, described in similar terms by multiple independent researchers who have arrived at it through different routes and from different starting points, is itself a form of evidence. Not evidence about what specifically was found, but evidence that something was found and that the finding was considered significant enough to justify the sustained institutional effort of concealment. The ancient landscape of Britain is not static. It continues to yield evidence through the natural processes of erosion and exposure, through agricultural operations that occasionally and accidentally reveal what the plough has preserved by moving across the top of it for centuries, through infrastructure development that brings ground investigation into contact with the subsurface archaeological record, and through the deliberate research of archaeologists and independent researchers who bring to it the tools of the current moment, tools that would have seemed magical to the investigators of the wartime period. Each year that passes, the available evidence grows. Each year, the gap between the evidence and the official account is more visible. Each year, the community of people, with the skills and the tools and the determination to pursue this investigation, grows larger and more capable. The management of the official record has been remarkably effective for over 70 years. Whether it can be equally effective for another 70 years, in the face of publicly available LiDAR data, digitized historical archives, satellite imagery of meter-scale resolution, and a research community that has learned to work around institutional resistance rather than waiting for institutional cooperation, is a question that the coming decades will answer. The ultimate significance of this investigation is not what it reveals about specific sites or specific survey results or specific decisions made by specific officials in the post-war period. Its ultimate significance is what it reveals about the relationship between a society and the knowledge it holds of its own past. A society that allows its government to manage, without transparency and without accountability, the official record of what its ancient landscape contains, is a society that has surrendered something important. Not just information, though information matters, and the information that has been withheld matters considerably. It has surrendered the right to a complete and honest understanding of where it comes from, what the people who preceded it on this land were capable of, and what the full extent of the human achievement in the landscape it inhabits actually was. The ancient people of Britain built their monuments in the expectation that they would last. They did last. The obligation of every generation that lives in the landscape those ancient people shaped is to understand them as completely and as honestly as the evidence allows. That obligation is discharged by doing the work of investigation with full access to the available evidence. It is not discharged and cannot be discharged when a significant portion of the most relevant evidence is withheld by institutions that have decided, without public consultation and without public accountability, that the public does not need to know. Every major ancient landscape in Britain, from the Stonehenge complex to the Avebury system, from the Highland stone circles to the Orcadian monument clusters, from the Pembrokeshire bluestone quarries to the Somerset wetlands, contains more than the official record shows, not as a matter of speculation, as a matter of documented fact, established through the comparison of historical and current cartographic records, through the analysis of publicly available LiDAR data, through the partial releases from restricted archives, and through the patient fieldwork of independent researchers who have walked the landscape with historical maps and found what was there that the current maps do not show. The question of what specifically lies in those underground spaces, what connects the major ancient complexes to each other and to the landscape around them in ways that the public record does not describe, what the wartime and post-war official surveys found that prompted the decision to manage public knowledge of it, is a question whose full answer is still in the archive, waiting for the access that has been sought and denied for 7 decades. The work of seeking that access and the broader work of assembling from the available evidence the most complete picture that the current state of knowledge allows is the work of this generation of researchers, and it is work whose importance to the full and honest understanding of what Britain is and what it was cannot be overstated. The modern researcher approaching this subject for the first time often makes the mistake of expecting to find a single dramatic smoking gun, a document that explicitly states what was found and why it was hidden, a memorandum from a senior official that uses plain language to describe the discovery that prompted 7 decades of cartographic management. That document, if it exists, is not available. What is available is something in some ways more revealing, because it is more real. What is available is the cumulative pattern of a very large number of smaller pieces of evidence, each individually capable of innocent explanation, but collectively forming a picture whose interpretation requires either the conclusion that the British state has been systematically managing public knowledge of its ancient landscape, or the conclusion that an extraordinarily consistent series of coincidences has, over 70 years and across dozens of sites and multiple administrative reorganizations, produced the appearance of systematic management without its substance. The second conclusion requires more credulity than the evidence supports. The final accounting of what has been done to the public record of the ancient British landscape and why is not yet possible. The archive is not fully open. The FOI process has not produced full disclosure. The individuals who know the most about the specific decisions made in the post-war years are no longer available to be asked. What is possible is an honest account of what the available evidence shows, an honest acknowledgement of what it does not show, and an honest statement of the questions that remain open and that remain worth pursuing. The available evidence shows systematic managed reduction of public information about ancient sites in Britain since the 1940s. It shows concentration of that management on underground and subsurface features. It shows direct Ministry of Defence involvement in cartographic decisions that the official account has never fully explained. It shows archival restriction applied to survey results, whose connection to current defence concerns is, in many cases, either impossible to identify or implausibly remote. And it shows a sustained pattern of institutional resistance to transparency that has persisted across 7 decades and that continues to the present day. Those are the facts. Their interpretation is not simple, but the work of honest inquiry begins with the facts, and the facts are clear enough to justify the investigation and to reward it. The ancient landscape of Britain is still there. The chalk is still white under the thin green skin of the downland turf. The limestone is still pale under the Cotswold fields. The standing stones are still standing in their circles against the sky. And somewhere beneath that landscape, in the spaces between the geological layers and the human layers, in the underground environments that prehistoric people knew and worked and moved through, with a confidence and a purpose that we have only begun to appreciate, there is a story that has not yet been fully told. The work of telling it is the most important unfinished project in the archaeology of Britain, and it belongs not to any official institution or any academic authority, but to every person who stands in the ancient landscape and feels, in the particular quality of attention, that those places reliably produce, that there is more here than they have been told. There is considerably more, and the effort to know what it is, fully and honestly, and without the management of official institutions that have decided the public cannot handle the truth of their own most ancient inheritance, is the work to which this investigation is devoted and to which it calls everyone who hears it. What we owe the ancient builders of Britain is not veneration or mythology. It is not the uncritical embrace of alternative histories that replace one inadequate account with another equally inadequate account dressed in more dramatic clothing. What we owe them is the intellectual honesty and the civic determination to insist that the full available evidence about who they were and what they built should be part of the public record that all of us have access to. That no institution should be permitted to maintain indefinitely a selective and managed version of that record without public accountability, and that the ancient landscape of Britain, which belongs to every person who lives within it, and to the broader human inheritance of which it is an extraordinary part, should be understood as completely and as honestly as the evidence, fully and fairly presented, allows. That is what this investigation has been working toward. That is what 7 decades of patient and often frustrating research by independent scholars and field workers and archival researchers has been building toward. And that is what the coming years of LiDAR analysis and ground-penetrating radar and continued archival access and the growing power of the independent research community to document and distribute its findings will, in the end, produce. The full picture, the honest account, the story of ancient Britain as it actually was, in all its extraordinary and still incompletely understood complexity, told without the managing hand of institutions that have for too long decided what the public is allowed to know about the landscape beneath its own feet. The investigation of this subject is not over. It has not reached a conclusion. The archive is not open. The maps have not been corrected. The restricted survey results have not been released. The full picture of what the British government found beneath its own ancient soil and what it decided the public should not be allowed to know about those findings is still locked behind the legal mechanisms and the institutional inertia and the sustained bureaucratic management that have kept it locked for over 70 years. But the investigation is further along than it has ever been. The tools available to independent researchers are better than they have ever been. The community of people doing this work is larger and more capable than it has ever been. The evidence base, assembled from dozens of independent lines of research that have converged on a consistent picture from different directions and through different methodologies, is more substantial and more difficult to dismiss than it has ever been. The questions that this investigation raises are more clearly formulated and more clearly documented than they have ever been, and the public interest in them, the natural human interest in the deep past of the landscape we inhabit, and the honest desire to know what is actually there, beneath the green surface of the downland and the moorland and the ancient fields of Britain, is as powerful as it has ever been. That interest will not go away. It will continue to drive the work, and the work will continue to produce the evidence that makes the full and honest account of the ancient landscape of Britain inevitable. It is not a question of whether the full picture will eventually be known. It is a question of when. The answer to that question depends, in significant part, on how many people decide that the knowing of it matters.